Okay, so you want to own a satellite ground station, a giant dish that talks to satellites in space. Thousands of new satellites launch every year and everyone needs a dish like this. But there's a hard limit on how much money one dish can ever make. I dug through real FCC filings and Amazon's own pricing data to find real information, and I found some real information about what it costs to build, why tech giants skip building their own, and the number that decides if it survives. So everything in this video is based on research. Let's start with the most basic question first. What actually is a ground station? A satellite floating in space cannot talk to your phone or your TV directly. It needs a giant dish on the ground to send it instructions and to receive the information it collects, like pictures or weather data. That giant dish is called a ground station. Think of it like a mailbox. The satellite is flying overhead dropping off mail, and the dish is the only mailbox on the ground that can catch it. Every weather report you see, every bit of satellite internet, every picture taken from space passes through one of these dishes first. Now, let's answer the first thing I promised you. What does it actually cost to build one? In my research, I found real numbers from a station in Germany called Fuchsstadt, built back in 1985. It had giant dishes, some of them over 100 feet wide. Building just 2 of those big dishes, plus the equipment to run them, cost about 78 million German marks at the time. Add another 30 million marks for the buildings around them, and the whole project came out to around 120 million marks total. In today's money, that's easily in the tens of millions of dollars, just to get 2 dishes standing and working. And that number doesn't even include paying staff, buying insurance, or getting the legal paperwork done to run it, which we'll get to in a minute. So building your own dish is expensive. But here's something interesting I found while researching this. You don't actually have to build one at all. Companies like Amazon and Microsoft, yes, the same Amazon that delivers your packages, owns giant networks of these dishes already, all around the world. Instead of building your own, you can simply pay them to use theirs for a few minutes at a time, kind of like renting a car instead of buying one. Amazon calls this ground station as a service, which is just a fancy way of saying rent our dish instead of building your own. Their prices run from about $3 a minute up to $22 a minute, depending on how much data you're sending. Amazon says this can save a company up to 80% compared to building a dish from scratch. So that answers question 2. Build it yourself for tens of millions of dollars, or rent time on someone else's for a few dollars a minute. Now here's the part that answers the third thing I promised you, the hard limit I mentioned at the start, and this is honestly the most important idea in the whole video. A satellite doesn't sit still in the sky above your dish forever. Most modern satellites move around the Earth constantly, which means they are only visible to any single dish for a short window of time, usually somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes, before they disappear over the horizon, just like the sun rising and setting. And depending on the satellite's path, it might only fly close enough to your dish a handful of times a day. This means every single dish on Earth, no matter how expensive it was to build, has a hard ceiling on how many minutes of paid time it can ever sell in one day. You cannot make the sky bigger. You cannot make satellites fly by more often just because you want more money. The dish either has a satellite in view right now, or it doesn't, and there's nothing you can do to change that schedule. People in the industry actually have a name for this idea, and I want to explain it simply because it sounds more complicated than it is. It's called contact window utilization. All that means is, out of all the minutes your dish could possibly be used in a day, what percentage of those minutes actually got booked and paid for? Think of your dish like a single swing at a playground. Only one kid can use the swing at a time, and each turn only lasts a few minutes. If kids are lined up back to back all day, that swing is making the most of its time. If it just sits there empty between turns, it's wasting its potential. A ground station works exactly the same way. So now let's talk about what makes this business hard, because 2 things work against you here. The first problem is that giant companies like Amazon and Microsoft can spread the cost of one dish across thousands of different customers throughout the day. If you're a small company trying to build and run just one dish for just 1 or 2 clients, you simply cannot compete on price with a company splitting the bill among 1,000 paying users. Even the world's biggest private ground station company, a Norwegian company called KSAT, which owns more than 200 dishes in over 40 countries, decided the smartest move was to team up with Amazon instead of fighting them on price. The second problem is the risk that something completely new comes along and makes your expensive dish pointless. And this actually already happened once, in real life. Remember that station in Germany I mentioned earlier, Fuchsstadt? In the 1980s, it was one of the most important buildings in the entire world for international phone calls and TV broadcasts. Companies spent a fortune building it because at the time, satellite dishes were the only way to send a phone call across the ocean. Then something changed. Companies started laying fiber optic cables, thin glass wires, along the bottom of the ocean, and it turned out these cables could carry way more information way faster and way cheaper than a satellite dish ever could. Within about 15 years, most of the international calls that used to go through that giant, expensive station moved onto the cables instead. A building that cost tens of millions of dollars and was built to last for decades became mostly useless in less time than it takes to pay off a house. The dishes are still standing there today, but the business they were built for mostly disappeared. Alright, let's answer the last thing I promised you. The one number that actually decides if a dish like this makes millions or barely survives. After researching this deeply, it comes back to that same idea from earlier: contact window utilization. How many of your possible minutes actually get used and paid for? Let's compare two simple examples so you can see exactly what I mean. Example 1. You build your own dish, just for one client, costing somewhere between $10 and $20 million. But that client's satellites only fly close enough to use your dish a few times a day. Maybe only 20 to 30% of your possible minutes ever get used. The rest of the time, your incredibly expensive dish is just sitting there, doing nothing, earning nothing, while you're still paying the loan on it. Example 2. Instead, you rent out your dish to lots of different companies throughout the day, the same way Amazon does. Now, instead of one client using your dish a few times a day, you have dozens of different satellites lining up to use it all day long, back to back, like that busy playground swing. Your utilization can jump to 60% or higher. At a price of $3 to $22 per minute multiplied across a full day of steady bookings, that difference between 20% used and 60% used is the entire difference between a dish that loses money every single month and one that becomes a genuinely profitable piece of the space industry. So, here's the simple verdict on owning a satellite ground station. Building your own dish costs a lot, tens of millions of dollars, and that's a big, risky bet. There are rules from the government you have to follow too, called licenses, which cost money and take time to get approved. Once it's built, your dish only makes money when a satellite is actually flying overhead, and that only happens for a few minutes at a time, a few times a day, no matter how much money you spent. And there's always a chance that some new technology like fiber optic cables did before could come along and make your expensive dish much less useful, even if it still works perfectly fine. But here's the simple truth underneath everything in this video. Owning a satellite ground station isn't really about owning a big fancy dish. It's about owning a few short minutes of empty sky over and over again, and trying to fill as many of those minutes as possible before the satellite disappears and you have to wait for the next one.